whispered, "Don't look there." But Caleb Lawson didn't take orders. Covered in wilderness dirt and raw defiance, the mountain man locked eyes with the town's untouchable bride-to-be. What he did next didn't just break the rules, it ignited a scandal that burned Oakhaven to the ground. The year was 1882, and the logging town of Oakhaven, Colorado, was a place built on rigid rules, heavy Bibles, and unforgiving judgments. It was a town where your reputation was worth more than gold, and no one had a higher, more polished reputation than Abigail Preston. Abigail was the daughter of Judge Harrison Preston, the man who practically owned the gavel and the gallows in the county. She was 21, breathtakingly beautiful, and trapped. To the town, she was a porcelain doll sitting on a velvet cushion. To herself, she was a bird suffocating in a gilded cage. For months, she had been betrothed to Beauregard Montgomery, the wealthiest banker in Oakhaven. Beauregard was a man of impeccable tailored suits, pomaded hair, and a cruel, possessive streak that he kept carefully hidden behind a charming smile. He viewed Abigail not as a partner, but as his finest acquisition, the crown jewel in his empire of wealth. It was the sweltering afternoon of the Founders' Day Jubilee. The town square was a sea of parasols, sweating gentlemen in wool coats and gossiping women. Abigail stood on the raised wooden VIP platform beside Beauregard, feeling the brutal midday sun beating down on her. She was laced into a suffocatingly tight corset, layered under heavy emerald green silk that Beauregard had ordered specifically for her from Paris. "Stand up straight, Abigail," Beauregard hissed under his breath, smiling thinly at the crowd. "Mrs. Henrietta Gable is watching, and I won't have the town gossip saying my fiancé looks like a wilting daisy." Abigail swallowed hard, her vision blurring slightly at the edges. "It is terribly hot, Beauregard. I just need a sip of water." After my speech, he snapped, his grip tightening around her waist like a vice. It was in that miserable, suffocating moment that the town square suddenly went dead silent. The lively fiddle music screeched to a halt. The chatter died in the throats of the townsfolk. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, pulling back with a mixture of fear and absolute disgust. Walking down the center of the dusty thoroughfare was Caleb Lawson. He was a mountain man who lived high up in the jagged peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range, a place no civilized man dared to venture. Caleb stood 6'4", with broad shoulders draped in a heavy, weather-beaten leather duster and wolf pelts. His dark hair curled wildly at the nape of his neck, and a rugged, shadow-dusted jaw framed a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and pure, untamed danger. Caleb only came down from the mountain twice a year to trade his furs for supplies, and the town despised him for his lawless freedom. "Keep your children back," Henrietta Gable loudly whispered, clutching her pearl necklace. "It's that feral beast from the ridge." Beauregard scoffed, stepping slightly in front of Abigail as if to shield his property from a stray dog. He looked down at his men, Sheriff Wyatt Caldwell and a few hired deputies. "Keep that mountain trash away from the platform," Beauregard ordered loudly, making sure the entire square heard his authority. Then, glaring directly at Caleb, he pointed his silver-tipped cane. "Keep your eyes down, savage. Buy your flour and get out. And whatever you do, don't look there." Beauregard gestured emphatically toward the VIP platform, specifically toward Abigail. It was the wrong thing to say to a man who answered only to the wind and the wolves. Caleb's heavy leather boots stopped in the dust. He slowly turned his head. From beneath the wide brim of his battered Stetson, piercing, storm-gray eyes drifted up to the platform. He didn't look at the sheriff. He didn't look at the judge. He bypassed Beauregard entirely. Caleb Lawson looked right at Abigail Preston. The stare was electric. It was heavy, brazen, and entirely unashamed. Abigail felt a jolt run through her entire body, a sudden burning heat that had nothing to do with the Colorado sun. In those storm-gray eyes, she didn't see the feral beast the town described. She saw a man who saw her not the banker's prize, not the judge's daughter, but a terrified, suffocating woman trapped in a silk prison. "I said, keep your eyes on the dirt," Beauregard bellowed, his face flushing crimson with sudden rage. He slammed his cane against the wooden planks, but the mountain man kept staring. The tension in the air was so thick it could be sliced with a blade. And then, Caleb did the unthinkable. He didn't look away. He started walking toward the platform. Murmurs of panic rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Caldwell rested his hand on his revolver, but he didn't draw. There was something so deliberately calm, so terrifyingly focused about Caleb's advance that it froze the lawman in place. "Stop right there, Lawson," the judge yelled, rising from his chair. Caleb ignored him. He stepped up onto the first wooden stair, his heavy boots making the platform shudder. Abigail's heart hammered furiously against her ribs. The lack of oxygen from her corset, combined with the sheer, overwhelming presence of the man approaching her, made her sway. The edges of her vision turned black. She was going to faint right there in front of the entire county, cementing Beauregard's humiliation. She gasped, her hands trembling as she grabbed the wooden railing for support. Beauregard didn't reach for her. Instead, he raised his silver-tipped cane, aiming to strike Caleb for daring to step onto his stage. "Get back, you filthy animal!" Before the cane could fall, Caleb moved with the blinding speed of a striking viper. He grabbed the cane midair with his left hand, effortlessly wrenching it from Beauregard's grasp and tossing it into the dust below. The town erupted in a collective gasp. But Caleb wasn't there for Beauregard. He stepped directly in front of Abigail. Up close, the sheer size of him was overwhelming. He didn't smell like filth. He smelled like rain, leather, and raw masculine heat. "You can't breathe," Caleb said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that sent a shiver straight down Abigail's spine. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her all day, not as a piece of property, but as a human being in distress. I am fine," she choked out, though she was swaying precariously. "No, you ain't," Caleb muttered. With a swift, terrifying motion that made women in the crowd scream, Caleb reached to his belt and pulled a massive, wicked-looking hunting knife. "He's going to kill her!" Henrietta Gable shrieked. Sheriff Caldwell finally drew his gun. Lawson dropped the blade. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't take his eyes off Abigail's terrified, wide, emerald-green eyes. "Hold still," he whispered gently. With a deft, precise flick of his wrist, Caleb reached behind Abigail. He didn't touch her skin, but he brought the razor-sharp edge of the blade directly against the thick, tightly knotted silk ribbons at the back of her bodice, the restrictive corset laces that were slowly crushing her ribs. Rip. The sound of tearing silk and snapping laces echoed loudly across the silent, stunned town square. Instantly, the brutal pressure on Abigail's chest vanished. Her ribs expanded. She took a massive, desperate gasp of air, her lungs filling for the first time all day. The sudden rush of oxygen made her knees buckle, but she didn't hit the floor. Caleb dropped his knife and caught her. His massive, calloused hands gripped her waist firmly, holding her upright against his solid chest. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the judge's refined daughter was wrapped in the embrace of the mountain outcast. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, her face flushed, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely, utterly safe. "Better?" he asked softly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Yes," she breathed, staring at his lips. "Get your filthy hands off my fiancé!" Beauregard screamed, practically frothing at the mouth. He lunged forward, throwing a desperate, uncoordinated punch. Caleb sidestepped effortlessly, letting Beauregard stumble past him and nearly fall off the stage. Gently, Caleb set Abigail back on her feet. He unhooked a leather canteen from his belt, popped the cork, and pressed it into her trembling hands. "Keep it. Mountain water, colder than the poison they serve down here," Caleb said, his eyes burning into hers with a promise that terrified and thrilled her. Without another word, Caleb turned his back on the furious banker, the shocked sheriff, and the utterly speechless town. He walked down the steps, strode to his loaded pack mule, and began his long trek back up the mountain. He had just publicly humiliated the most powerful man in Oakhaven, ruined an expensive Paris gown, and placed his hands on the town's untouchable virgin. He didn't just break the rules, he shattered them. And as Abigail Preston stood on the stage, clutching the rough leather canteen to her chest, She knew with absolute certainty that her life would never be the same again. The backlash was swift and brutal. Within an hour, Abigail was escorted back to the Preston family mansion and locked in her bedroom. The town was in an absolute uproar. Down at the saloon, the men were already whispering that the mountain man had cast some sort of dark, feral spell on the judge's daughter. Henrietta Gable had spent the entire afternoon going from porch to porch, claiming Caleb Lawson had practically assaulted Abigail on the stage. But what haunted Abigail the most wasn't the gossip. It was the moment Beauregard had dragged her into the parlor before locking her away. "You humiliated me," Beauregard had hissed, his polished veneer completely gone. He had grabbed her upper arm with such vicious force that his fingers left dark, purpling bruises against her pale skin. "You let that savage touch you. We are moving the wedding up to this Sunday. I will lock you in my house, Abigail, and I will teach you how to behave." Now, sitting by her moonlit window, Abigail gently touched the bruises on her arm. A terrifying realization washed over her. Beauregard Montgomery was a monster in a fine suit. If she married him, she would die in his house, suffocated by his control, just like she had suffocated in that corset. She looked down at her dressing table. Sitting there was Caleb's weathered leather canteen. She reached out and traced the worn seams. She remembered the heat of his hands, the terrifying gentleness in his eyes, and the sheer bravery it took to stand against an entire town just to let her breathe. A wild, reckless spark ignited in Abigail's chest. She had played the good daughter her whole life. Where had it led her? To bruises and a locked door. It was near midnight. The house was dead silent. Abigail stripped off her restrictive crinolines and heavy silks. She dug into the back of her wardrobe and pulled out a simple, durable wool riding skirt and a dark linen blouse, clothes she hadn't worn since she was a tomboy child running through the fields before the town's expectations had chained her down. She tied her long auburn hair back with a piece of twine, grabbed the canteen, and slipped out her bedroom window, climbing down the sturdy oak trellis. The forest at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was dark, cold, and foreboding. But Abigail didn't stop. She pushed through the dense thickets of pine and silver birch, guided only by the silver moonlight and the faint smell of wood smoke in the air. She hiked for over an hour, her lungs burning, her hands scratched by branches. Just as fear began to creep into her mind, she saw it, the faint, golden glow of a campfire nestled in a clearing at the base of the ridge. Caleb Lawson was sitting on a fallen log, whittling a piece of cedar with the very same knife he had used to cut her loose. He didn't look up when she stepped into the clearing. "I wondered if you had the nerve to come up here," Caleb said, his deep voice carrying over the crackling fire. Abigail stepped into the light, her chest heaving. "How did you know I would come?" "A bird that gets a taste of air outside the cage always tries to fly," he replied, finally looking up. His eyes widened a fraction when he took in her appearance. Gone was the painted porcelain doll. Standing before him was a wild, flushed, incredibly brave woman. She walked over and held out the canteen. "I came to return this, and to thank you." Caleb stood, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. He didn't take the canteen. Instead, his eyes zeroed in on her forearm, where the sleeve of her linen blouse was pushed back. His jaw instantly clenched. The relaxed mountain man vanished, replaced by something dark and intensely dangerous. He reached out, his rough fingers hovering just millimeters above the dark purple bruises on her skin. Montgomery did this. It wasn't a question. Abigail looked away, shame burning her cheeks. "It doesn't matter. I am marrying him on Sunday." "No, you ain't," Caleb growled. "You don't understand how Oakhaven works," Abigail whispered, tears of frustration finally spilling over her eyelashes. "My father is the judge. Beauregard owns the bank. They own me, Caleb. I have nowhere to go." Caleb stepped closer, closing the distance between them. The heat radiating off him was intoxicating. "I didn't come to town today just for flour, Abigail," he said softly. "I came down because Montgomery's men have been poisoning the river up near the ridge, trying to force out the independent miners so he can steal their claims for pennies. He's a thief, a liar, and a coward. I was going to drag him out of his bank today by his throat. But then, I saw you on that stage. looking like you were dying. Abigail looked up into his stormy eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. Why did you help me? You don't know me. Caleb reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed away a tear from her cheek. I know enough. I know you're too much fire to be smothered by a man like him. The air between them crackled. The rules of society, the judgments of the town, the impending marriage, all of it melted away into the dark forest night. Driven by a primal instinct she didn't know she possessed, Abigail leaned into his touch. Caleb groaned, a deep, ragged sound, and pulled her flush against his chest. When his mouth crashed down on hers, it was an explosion. It wasn't the polite, dry, controlling pecks Beauregard gave her. It was desperate, fierce, and entirely consuming. Abigail wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing the outcast mountain man with everything she had, surrendering to the wildness she had been denied her whole life. But they were not alone. Neither of them heard the snap of the twig in the brush just 20 yards away. Henrietta Gable, who had seen Abigail sneaking out of the mansion and followed her out of pure, malicious curiosity, stood hiding behind a massive pine tree. Her eyes were wide with shock and malicious glee as she witnessed the judge's virgin daughter passionately kissing the town's greatest enemy. Henrietta didn't wait to see more. She gathered her skirts and practically sprinted back down the mountain path, heading straight for the saloon. Back in the clearing, Caleb slowly broke the kiss, resting his forehead against Abigail's. They were both breathless. If you stay here tonight, Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion, you can never go back. They'll ruin you. I am already ruined, Abigail smiled, feeling free for the very first time. I want to stay. Before Caleb could answer, a haunting sound drifted up from the valley below. It was the loud, frantic clanging of the town's church bell, the alarm used only for fires or a manhunt. Caleb's head snapped toward the town. His keen mountain eyes squinted into the darkness. Down at the base of the trail, a serpent of orange fire was beginning to form. It was a line of torches. They know, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm as he stepped in front of Abigail, shielding her. Down below, Beauregard Montgomery was leading a posse of 30 heavily armed men, whipping them into a violent frenzy. The banker had a loaded Winchester rifle in his hands, and his face was twisted in a mask of pure, homicidal rage. The town of Oak Haven wasn't coming to rescue their beloved daughter. They were coming to hang Caleb Lawson and destroy the woman who had dared to love him. The mountain came alive with the terrifying symphony of a manhunt. The deep, guttural baying of bloodhounds echoed off the granite cliffs of the Sangre de Cristo range, intertwining with the furious shouts of drunken men and the sharp cracks of rifles firing blindly into the dark. Caleb did not panic. His movements were frighteningly efficient. He kicked dirt over the campfire, plunging their small clearing into absolute darkness, and grabbed his heavy Winchester rifle from where it leaned against a pine trunk. We have to move. Now, Caleb ordered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through Abigail's rising terror. They have dogs, Caleb, Abigail whispered, her hands trembling as she looked down at the winding snake of torches growing larger by the second. There are too many of them. If they catch you, my father will let Beauregard hang you from the courthouse oak. Caleb stepped close, gripping her shoulders with large, steadying hands. Even in the darkness, she could feel the intense, unyielding heat of his gaze. They ain't catching me, and they sure as hell ain't touching you. But you have to trust me, Abigail. The mountain is my home. They are just trespassers in the dark. She nodded once, swallowing her fear. Caleb whistled sharply, a low, trilling sound, and his sturdy pack mule trotted over from the brush. He grabbed a heavy canvas satchel from the saddle, slung it over his broad shoulder, and gave the mule a firm slap on the flank, sending the animal trotting off down a separate trail to confuse the hounds. Then, Caleb took Abigail's hand. His grip was an anchor in the storm. For hours, they climbed. The terrain grew impossibly treacherous as they left the soft pine needle floor of the lower forest and ascended into the jagged, unforgiving rock formations of the higher altitudes. The thin, freezing air burned Abigail's lungs like inhaled glass. Her wool riding skirt, heavy with dew and mud, dragged at her legs, and the soles of her town boots were bruised by the sharp shale. Yet she did not complain. Every time she stumbled, Caleb was there, his arm wrapping around her waist to pull her up, his physical strength seemingly limitless. Just before dawn, as the sky turned the color of a bruised plum, Caleb led her behind a massive waterfall that concealed the entrance to a deep, dry limestone cavern. The sound of the rushing water perfectly masked their footsteps and would wash away their scent from the hounds. Abigail collapsed against the cavern wall, her chest heaving, sliding down until she hit the cold stone floor. Caleb immediately knelt beside her, pulling a thick, heavy buffalo robe from his satchel and wrapping it securely around her shivering shoulders. "We are safe here," Caleb muttered, striking a single match to light a small brass lantern. The golden glow illuminated the rugged plains of his exhausted face. "The water covers our tracks. They won't find this cave." Abigail pulled the heavy fur tight around her, the adrenaline finally wearing off, leaving a hollow, terrifying reality in its wake. "Caleb, why is Beauregard leading a lynch mob? He is a cruel man, yes, but to whip up 30 men in the middle of the night just because I left? It doesn't make sense. Half the town respects my father too much to risk hurting me in a crossfire." Caleb sat back on his heels, his storm gray eyes heavy with a dark, dangerous secret. He reached into his canvas satchel and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. The edges were singed, and the pages were stained with something dark and rusted. "Blood. He ain't out there hunting you, Abigail," Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. "And he ain't out there just to defend his wounded pride. He's out there because he knows what I took from his hired men 3 days ago. He's fighting for his own neck." Abigail stared at the ledger, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is that?" "Proof," Caleb answered, tossing the heavy book onto the stone floor between them. "Your fiancé ain't just a banker, he's a butcher. For the past year, Beauregard has been using the Oak Haven Bank to funnel stolen payroll funds from the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. When the independent miners up on the ridge refused to sell their land to him so he could lay track for the railroad's expansion, he didn't just evict them. He hired gunmen, real killers." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "Killers?" "He hired former operatives from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency who went rogue," Caleb explained, his jaw clenching in fury. "Men like Charles Siringo might write books about justice, but the men Beauregard hired only care about gold. They've been poisoning the wells, burning cabins, and shooting miners in the back. I found this ledger in the saddlebags of one of his hired guns after I caught him trying to burn out an old prospector. This book details every stolen dollar, every bribe paid to your sheriff, and every murder Beauregard ordered." The cavern spun around Abigail, the town she had grown up in, the polite society, the fancy dresses. It was all built on a foundation of blood and corruption. Sheriff Caldwell was on Beauregard's payroll. Her own father, the judge, was completely blind to the monster operating right under his nose. "If Beauregard marries you, he secures his ties to the judge," Caleb continued, his eyes softening as he looked at her pale face. "He makes himself untouchable. But if this ledger makes it to a federal marshal, Beauregard hangs." Abigail reached out with trembling fingers and touched the blood-stained leather cover. The realization hit her with the force of a runaway train. She wasn't just a runaway bride anymore. She was sitting on the explosive truth that could destroy the most powerful man in the county. "He will never stop hunting us," Abigail whispered, looking up into Caleb's eyes. "I know," Caleb replied, pulling his massive hunting knife and beginning to sharpen it against a wet stone. The rhythmic shk, shk of the steel filled the cavern. "That's why we ain't going to keep running. When the sun comes up, we are going to end this." Abigail looked at the wild, untamed mountain man. Yesterday, she had been a suffocating porcelain doll. Today, sitting in the dirt of a hidden cave, wrapped in a buffalo pelt alongside a wanted man, she felt a fierce, burning fire ignite in her soul. She didn't want to run either. She wanted Beauregard to burn. "Tell me what to do," Abigail said, her voice completely steady. Caleb paused his sharpening. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a slow, incredibly proud smile spread across his rugged face. "You're a brave woman, Abigail Preston, too brave for a town like Oakhaven. The morning sun crested the Sangre de Cristo peaks, bathing the jagged mountain range in a brilliant, blinding gold. The manhunt had stalled overnight, the hounds confused by the rushing river, and the men exhausted by the brutal altitude. Beauregard Montgomery stood at the edge of a massive granite cliff known by the locals as Devil's Drop. The ravine below was a sheer 600-foot plummet into a bed of jagged pine trees and merciless boulders. Beauregard's bespoke wool suit was torn. His expensive boots were caked in mud, and his face was a pale, sweating mask of absolute desperation. Sheriff Caldwell stood a few feet away, leaning heavily on his rifle, his deputies looking equally miserable. "The dogs lost the scent, Mr. Montgomery," Caldwell rasped, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "We've been climbing for 8 hours. The men are half frozen and out of whiskey. The girl is probably dead of exposure by now, and Lawson is long gone into the high country. We need to head back." "We are not going back!" Beauregard shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. He leveled his Winchester rifle directly at the sheriff's chest. "You work for me, Caldwell. I pay your salary. I own your badge. You will find that feral animal, and you will put a bullet in his skull, or I will put one in yours." The deputies shifted nervously, hands hovering over their holsters. The polite, charming banker they all knew had vanished, entirely replaced by a cornered, rabid animal. "Put the gun down, Beauregard." A deep, commanding voice echoed off the cliffside. Every man spun around. Standing on a raised ridge of limestone, silhouetted against the rising sun, was Caleb Lawson. He stood tall and unbothered, his heavy leather duster catching the mountain wind. His Winchester was resting casually against his shoulder, but his storm-gray eyes were locked onto Beauregard with lethal intent. "Shoot him!" Beauregard screamed, taking a step back toward the edge of Devil's Drop. "Caldwell! Shoot him right now!" Sheriff Caldwell raised his rifle, but before he could pull the trigger, a second figure stepped out from behind the massive boulder next to Caleb. The posse gasped in unison. It was Abigail. She was no longer the perfectly coiffed, delicate creature they knew. Her hair was wild and loose, blowing in the wind. Her linen blouse was streaked with mountain dirt, and she stood with her feet planted firmly apart. But it was what she held in her hands that froze the men in their tracks. She held the blood-stained, leather-bound ledger high in the air. "Nobody shoot!" Abigail's voice rang out, clear, authoritative, and utterly fearless. It was the voice of a judge's daughter, commanding the absolute attention of the court. "Sheriff Caldwell, if you fire your weapon, I will drop this book down the ravine, and without it, you will have no way to bargain for your life when the federal marshals find out what you've done." Caldwell froze, his face draining of color. "Miss Abigail, what are you talking about?" "The railroad money, Wyatt," Caleb boomed, his voice carrying over the wind. "The money Montgomery paid you to look the other way while his hired thugs slaughtered independent miners on the ridge. The ledger is right there in her hands. Every date, every dollar, every drop of blood." The deputies immediately stepped away from Caldwell, looking at their sheriff with shock and disgust. The posse of townsmen murmured in confusion, lowering their weapons. They had come to rescue a kidnapped bride, not to cover up a mass murder. Beauregard panicked. His pristine empire was crumbling in front of his eyes. "She's lying. The savage has brainwashed her. Caldwell, shoot them both." When Caldwell hesitated, Beauregard let out a feral roar, swung his rifle around, and fired directly at his own sheriff. The bullet caught Caldwell in the shoulder, spinning the lawman around and dropping him to the dirt, screaming. Chaos erupted on the cliffside. The deputies dove for cover behind the rocks. Beauregard jacked another round into the chamber and aimed wildly at the ridge where Caleb and Abigail stood. "I'll kill you! I'll kill both of you!" Crack. A gunshot echoed through the canyon. But it didn't come from Beauregard, and it didn't come from Caleb. Beauregard cried out in pain as the Winchester was violently blown from his hands, the wood splintering into 1,000 pieces. He stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding, shattered fingers, teetering precariously on the absolute edge of Devil's Drop. Riding up the narrow mountain trail, emerging from the tree line on massive thoroughbred horses, were 2 men. The first was Judge Harrison Preston, his face pale and etched with absolute horror. Beside him rode a man wearing a flat-brimmed hat, a heavy canvas coat, and a silver star pinned to his chest. It was United States Marshal Thomas Smith, a legendary lawman known for hunting down the most dangerous outlaws in the West. He sat in his saddle, his smoking Henry repeating rifle still raised. "That's enough, Montgomery," Marshal Smith bellowed, his voice like cracking thunder. Judge Preston slid from his horse and ran toward the base of the ridge, looking up at his daughter with tears in his eyes. "Abigail, dear God, Abigail, are you hurt?" Abigail lowered the ledger, her hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. She looked down at her father. "I am unharmed, Father. But Caleb Lawson saved my life. Beauregard. Beauregard is a monster." Marshal Smith nudged his horse forward, his hard eyes sweeping over the bleeding sheriff and the terrified deputies. "We received a telegraph in Denver 3 weeks ago from a dying Pinkerton agent, confessed to taking dirty money from an Oak Haven banker to kill miners. I've been riding hard to get here, and it looks like I arrived just in time." The marshal looked up at Caleb, tipping his hat slightly. "Seems you did my job for me, mountain man." Beauregard, clutching his bleeding hand, looked at the marshal, then at the judge, and finally up at Abigail and Caleb. The realization that he had lost everything, his wealth, his status, his freedom, snapped the last fragile thread of his sanity. "You think you've won?" Beauregard spat, blood spraying from his lips as he laughed maniacally. "I am Beauregard Montgomery. I own this mountain. I own all of you." Driven by pure, blinding madness, Beauregard pulled a small silver derringer from his waistcoat pocket and lunged blindly toward the ridge. "Beauregard, no," the judge screamed. But Beauregard didn't even make it 3 steps. His expensive, mud-caked boots slipped on the loose shale at the edge of the cliff. He flailed wildly, his eyes going wide with sudden absolute terror as gravity took hold. He didn't even have time to scream before he pitched backward, disappearing over the edge of Devil's Drop, plummeting into the misty abyss below. Silence fell over the mountain, heavy and absolute, save for the whistling wind. Marshal Smith sighed, slowly holstering his rifle. "Deputies, bind Sheriff Caldwell's wounds and arrest him." "Judge Preston, I believe we have a lot of paperwork to go through regarding the ownership of that bank." Judge Preston nodded numbly, his eyes never leaving his daughter. Caleb turned to Abigail. He didn't say a word. He just gently took the heavy ledger from her hands, tossed it down to the marshal, and pulled her into his chest. Abigail wrapped her arms around his waist, burying her face in the heavy leather of his duster, breathing in the scent of pine, smoke, and safety. An hour later, the posse had cleared out, taking the wounded and the arrested back down to face justice. Judge Preston stood near his horse, looking up at Abigail and Caleb, who had remained on the ridge. "Abigail," the judge called out softly, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "It's time to go home. We can put this all behind us. The town will understand." Abigail looked at her father. She loved him, but she finally saw him for what he was, a man chained to the opinions of a toxic, suffocating society. She looked down at her bruised, muddy skirt and then up into Caleb's storm-gray eyes. In them, she saw the vast, untamed wilderness. She saw freedom. "I am home, Father," Abigail said, her voice echoing clearly over the canyon. Judge Preston stared at her for a long, heartbreaking moment. Then, he slowly nodded, a sad but deeply respectful smile touching his lips. He tipped his hat to Caleb, mounted his horse, and rode back down into the suffocating confines of Oak Haven. Alone on the mountain, Caleb cupped Abigail's face, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. "You sure about this? It's a hard life up here. No silk, no parasols." Abigail smiled, a brilliant, radiant expression that rivaled the rising sun. She reached up and pulled him down by his collar, pressing her lips to his. "I don't look there anymore, Caleb," she whispered against his mouth. "I only look at you." And high above the judgments of the world, where the air was thin and the eagles soared, the mountain man and his wild bride walked into the untamed frontier, entirely free. Did Abigail's incredible courage and Caleb's undeniable loyalty keep you on the edge of your seat? True love doesn't always follow the rules sometimes. It demands you break them. If you loved this wild, scandalous journey through the rugged Western frontier, smash that like button and share this story with someone who loves a fierce romance. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling tale. What would you have done in Abigail's shoes? Comment below.